Let's get started. So, welcome one and all to this interview with Eric Reinders. Now, this isn't the first time Eric has actually worked with us at the Tolkien Society. I say work in the loosest of sense, in that he's presented for us previously. I'm just going to share two links to his work that he's presented at Tolkien Society seminars. So Eric was with us twice in 2021 for the Tolkien and Diversity seminar, where he spoke let's get the right one in front of me, questions of caste in The Lord of the Rings and its multiple Chinese translations. Eric, am I right in saying that you're working on that at the moment for another book?
I'm working on a revised version of that topic on race for a book to be by Robin Ann Reed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, super. Yeah, I remember Robin telling me about that book, so that'll be really exciting to see how those ideas have developed in there. So yeah, we had him for Tolkien on diversity, and then translating and illustrating Tolkien, where he spoke about the problem of Eowyn's "No living man am I" in three Chinese translations, which also appeared in published proceedings for that seminar. Uh, but rather than tooting our own horn here at the Tolkien Society, and let's focus on Eric for a second. So, Eric Reinders is an associate professor of religion at Emory University, where he teaches courses on Chinese religion, religion and fantasy, and religion and the body. He has published monographs on British missionaries in China, iconoclasm in East Asia, and the films of Hayao Miyazaki. His latest book, Reading Tolkien in Chinese, Religion, Fantasy, and Translation, was published by Bloomsbury as part of the Perspectives. There we go. Thank you, Eric. Part of the Perspectives of Fantasy series earlier this year. We will post a link to the book as well. Anna?
Yes, so I have my copy as well. So yeah, Eric's book, Reading Tolkien in Chinese, it looks at multiple different Chinese translations of Tolkien's writing to try and uncover new and unique perspectives that enrich our meaning of the original text. So throughout the book, he has some translations from The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, The Children of Húrin, and Unfinished Tales. And by studying the back translations of the Chinese back into English, Eric digs into the conceptual common grounds that are shared by religion, fantasy, and translation, and covers themes like gods and heathens, race, mortality and immortality, fate and doom, and language. It really is an absolutely fascinating read, and I'm so looking forward to discussing this book with you today, Eric. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to spend just a little minute telling you about the format for the event. So we're going to start with the interview part. So Will and I are going to ask Eric some questions and kind of dig into the book. Eric's got some examples in a PowerPoint that he's going to share with us and talk us through. And we're going to have about 15 minutes at the end for an audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, pop them in the Q&A and we'll hopefully have time to get to them all at the end. So without further delay, let's get started.
Okay. Here we go. So, Eric, I was I was really curious about this. So obviously, like I know you from the seminars, but to go from like two papers at seminars to then having a whole book, I'm really curious about what started you on this journey for writing and then publishing Reading Tolkien in Chinese.
Well, first of all, thank you for hosting me and setting up this conversation. It's always a great pleasure to deal with the Tolkien Society. So I mean, my dissertation was on medieval Chinese Buddhism. My academic field was always religion in China, particularly related to when foreign things and foreign people entered China. So, for example, Buddhism came to China in the early medieval period, or where Christianity came into China. I was focusing mostly on the 19th century. And the interest in, well, fantasy generally I started off purely as a fan. In Atlanta, we have this gigantic event called Dragon Con, and I started going to it, and it's just quite a lot of fun. But I started thinking about it philosophically, thinking about the experience of pretending, where it's kind of collaborative pretending. People dress up in costume and they start kind of entering into the parts. And so, I was thinking philosophically about the performative aspects of identity. And so I started teaching a class called Religion and Fantasy. And I also I taught a class a few times on Miyazaki. So I think I was sort of developing these interests in the sort of philosophical aspects of fantasy. And then I was in China and I found a Chinese translation of Lord of the Rings, this one, by the Yilin Press. And just idle curiosity, really. I thought, I wonder what that sounds like in Chinese. And I was in China, but I had access to the internet, so I went on theonering.net and posted, some comments, and there was a bit of a dialogue. That was encouraging. And I put together some observations, made some presentations at ICFA, the International Conference for the Fantastic and the Arts, happens in Florida, and good reception. I put those thoughts together into an article, got published in the Journal for the Fantastic and the Arts. So I just thought, well, this is my destiny. So I just thought, okay, that's my book project. And it took a long while because I wasn't in any particular hurry. But, finally it came out. In those early publications, that first article, it was just talking about the one translation. But as time went on, I found another one and then another one. And I thought, my God, 3 translations of The Lord of the Rings, just exponentially more interesting than just one. So at certain points in the research, I had experiences of sort of, I would call it nerdgasms. Am I allowed to say that word? Nerdgasms? So sort of nerd nirvana moments when, you spend an hour figuring out the different ways that a certain thing is used, a certain word is used, and the Chinese resonances of the different ways of expressing it and so on. So it just became extremely pleasurable activity for me to spend an hour puttering around with these books. So eventually you have to let go of it. So I was fortunate that Bloomsbury put it into that series, the Perspectives on Fantasy series, where it joins some great other books in that series. Yeah.
Brilliant. So at the beginning of the book, in your introductory chapters, one thing that really struck me that was really beautiful was your descriptions of translation being a magical or an alchemical process. Could you explain this to our listeners?
Well, uh, you know, the subtitle, I would say the subtitle of the book, I'm going to keep showing you the book title, this little subtitle here, Religion, Fantasy, and Translation. I imagine those as Venn diagrams with 3 circles. And so I was trying to think of ways in which thinking about one of them might reflect on the other of the overlap. So, for example, religion and fantasy are very different, but they share this feature that they centrally focus on things which are normally impossible, like deities and miracles. And so, you know, if I say that if I talk about somebody's religion in fantasy terms, it sounds a bit insulting, but I don't mean it that way. So I started thinking about the intersections and about I got involved in translation studies theory. I'd always done translation in my research, and you know, I had my ideas about it, which were probably a bit homespun. But then when I started taking seriously translation theory, I found a very vibrant and active field of study. I was reading people like Venuti and Karen Emmerich and many others. And I joined a reading group on campus. And from that, I really changed my whole idea of translation. So I would say, first, I'm going to sort of do a detour on what translation is to me. First, the first thing I found is that we have to stop treating translations as a kind of sad consolation prize. It often gets treated as a kind of, you know, a second best. I understand the logic of that, but, you know, what if you don't speak English? What if the only Gandalf you know of is the one who speaks Chinese? And so I want to take that seriously. So I wanted to kind of challenge the hierarchy of the original and the translation. There's a chronological sequence that's incontestable. Right? First, there's the original, and then there's the translations. But I would say that I wanted to, as a kind of thought experiment, I wanted to invert that hierarchy and see how those new Middle Earths feel in the Chinese translations. I do see on the chat that the voice level in general is too low, but I just have a low voice. I apologize for that. So the second thing I got out of this translation, learning about translation, which was a new field for me, was that the idea of accuracy and fidelity is very complex. If you do a word-to-word translation of a text, it may feel like that's an accurate translation, but over and over you see it is a completely wrong translation. You cannot translate on a word-by-word basis. And doing so creates something that's fundamentally inaccurate. So I became very skeptical about this accuracy. And so what it means is that each translation is a reinterpretation. Now the translator, it's true, isn't concerned with plot, right? A translator isn't going to, I mean, basically, the translators that I was looking at, they changed nothing about the plot. But what they did change was every single word. So they're not doing the same thing as the original, but I wanted to look at the originals as stories in their own right. So getting to the question of alchemy. Another thing I got out of reading translation theory was that no matter how much you rationalize the process, and no matter how many dictionaries you use or what your process is, there always remains a kind of mysterious gap, a mysterious leap of faith when you simply just say this word in the source language is this word in the target language. You just, at some point, there comes just this jump, and it feels like a suspension of disbelief. A word in one language is never 100% identical to a word in another language. It simply doesn't function that way. When you think of, the moon and la lune, you could say, well, it's the same thing, but they're not really the same thing. They point to the same object in the sky. But when we move away from just that most rudimentary kind of definition by pointing at things, they're very different. So once you sort of abandon that notion that you're going to find an exact match, you get into this idea that there's a kind of irreducible, imaginative leap that's made. And so I thought it would be interesting to use some of the language of magic and religion, fantasy and religion, to talk about this jump, this gamble that one word is the same as another word. It's very much a thought experiment, and I think it needs a lot of development before I could be in any way systematic about it. But that was the intention, to use the language of each of those three terms to talk about the other. It's a very convoluted answer.
It was a really in-depth and fascinating answer. Thank you for that, Eric. You read the book. Actually, it's really useful as well, just to kind of hear it verbalized, just to really help some of the ideas sink in. So thank you. I feel that really helped me. And focusing on this concept of translation, one thing that really stood out to me as well, you spent a fair bit of time looking at do correct me if I pronounce this wrong. Moji, the magic ring. Thank you.
More,
Yeah, so and you spent a little bit of time talking about like the more exactly like you've just said about moon and la lune. It's not the same. Like the cultural meaning of that will be different. And so you go through some of these examples of the multifaceted meanings and some of the negative connotations as well associated with like I think off the top of my head there were like demons, ambiguity, trickery as well. And then, as you say, like these seem to connect. These really do seem to connect well with how Tolkien understood the ring. But I was curious, maybe if could we maybe link this to Tolkien's delineation of magic from enchantment in his lecture on fairy stories? Like, is there any kind of correlation there?
Just so people can see what we're talking about, let me just share screen, and I'll go to this slide. That's the word, that's the term that we're using, that we're talking about here. So let me stop sharing screen. Yeah, so the thing about More is that it characterizes it has a both negative and positive characterization, or a serious and a trivial characterization. So that sometimes it's used in words that really just mean conjuring or kind of fun tricks, but, you know, sort of amusements. It's not very serious. So magic as in magic show, you know, magic trick, that sort of thing. So in that case, if we're talking about the magic ring, you know, it feels very like a trinket, which is, I think, what, you know, how Bilbo understands the ring when he first encounters it. You know, he has no idea what the hell it is, you know. So he puts it on, it's just a big laugh, you know. So the character Morgier means magic ring, but the character Mor also connotes things like witchcraft or demons. So it has a much darker quality to it. And so that doesn't really carry over when you just translate it as the magic ring. Magic ring still ultimately sounds like something you'd find in a Christmas cracker, whereas the Chinese version of it, so Morjie is the general title for the whole franchise, for the whole thing is Morjie, as a kind of title for the whole thing, and it has this ambiguity there because More also has this witchcraft meaning, this demonology meaning, and so that's what you brought up there, Will, is this way in which the series title almost encapsulate the ambiguity of More, encapsulates the change that we see in attitudes to the ring from a trinket to this really horrible object. Now, yes, I must not get distracted by the chat. In fact, I'm going to turn off the chats because it's too. I'm going to stay on track if I keep looking at. So magic and enchantment. I mean, I'm not sure I quite see what the distinction is on fairy stories. Tolkien, I mean, there is this older attitude that you find towards magic, that it's something trivial or something lesser. That magic is mere manipulation. It's just, you know, you shouldn't take it too seriously. It's a kind of trivialized thing. But on the whole, when you look at Tolkien's attitude towards magic, it does seem to be, when he talks about elven magic, there's this wonderful conversation between Sam and Galadriel, is it? About what is magic, and she does, you know, they're talking about different things. So so I'm not sure what the connection is actually to on fairy stories. I'll have to look into that.
That's absolutely fine. It's you know, food for thought, maybe, but also like you said, uh, it's just really curious how like one word can have such deep meaning and resonance and bring so much with it. So yeah, thank you very much for your answer.
Yeah.
I think that kind of segues in nicely to my next question. I'd like to kind of move on to think about languages a bit, and to discuss some of the challenges of translating Tolkien's invented languages. So in the book, you do mention that in some places, Elvish or the Black speech is Romanized in the translations, but in some cases, you know, the translations have made choices with names, and sometimes they add real value. So one of the examples that you had was Udun, and I thought that was a really wonderful one where, you know, in English, the word is kind of meaningless, but in the translation, they managed to add a lot of value. So could we talk about that for a few minutes?
Okay, let me just share so people can see what we're talking about here. So Udun refers to, the flame of Udun. It refers to this deep fortress of Morgoth. Is that correct? This underground fortress. So it's very kind of hell-like fortress. And by itself, if you know Elven, I'm sure it means more, but otherwise it's just Udun. I don't know. It sort of vaguely sounds like udon noodles or something. I mean, it doesn't actually mean very much, as you just see the word. And in Chinese, there are many ways of transliterating English words. You can do them using a set of characters that are often used for transliteration, so that Chinese readers would be able to read that and just understand it. You're not looking at the meaning, it's just a transliteration of a foreign word. But there are ways in which this can be done rather cleverly, I think. So Deng Jiawan and Zhu Sheiheng, two of the translators, for the U part of Udun, use this word Wu, meaning, which can mean a crow, but also black, crow black, that sort of idea. And so it represents both the sound U and the meaning of darkness. The Dun part has various meanings, sudden and stamping the ground and so on. So here we go from a kind of two-syllable word to a thing that's still a two-syllable word, but it's got a bit of a darkness to it. I think that's a good example. I could give another example, which I think which I'm not sure I mentioned in the book or not, but
Oh yes, please do.
Yeah, another example of this kind of ingenious translation, I think, relates to the name of the primordial deity. So let me just share here as well. I don't like to share all the time. So the first line of the Ainu Lindale, we have, there was Eru, the one, who in Arda is called Iluvatar. So in the Elin translation, which was Elin is a publishing company, and there were several people doing the translations, so I reference it by the publishing company. So we have the only one, Weijr, Airu, in the Arda royal domain is called Luwata. So the word Eru is transliterated as Airu. It's basically the same, almost exactly the same sound, right? Airu. And Airu doesn't mean very much. I mean, it doesn't make sense if you're looking at meaning. And so I think, again, Chinese readers would simply go, Airu, that's just the sound of the person's name or the deity's name. Not bad. But Deng Jiawan often has ingenious ways of improving on small details like this. And she did two translations, an earlier one, and then she revised it. So in the earlier one, she has, in the beginning was Iru, the only god. Its name in the world was Iluweta. So we have this key, instead of Eru, or to represent the sound Eru, we have Iru, which sounds almost the same, right? And yet Iru is a term that has a kind of long Buddhist history, kind of deep philosophical resonance. I means one, and Ru is translated, it's got a variety of ways of translating it, but in a Buddhist context, it refers to the idea of thusness or in other words, reality. So it has this idea that, you know, what is reality? What is real? Well, it is what it is, you know. We can't really describe reality, it just is. So that's the idea of rule here, this thusness. So this term iru, and there are some variations like zhenru, the true thusness, has this kind of Buddhist background for the true nature of reality, which is that it is one and it is what it is. So, I think readers would still understand that as a name, but it's a name with a good bit of additional information in it, more so than eru. I mean, eru sounds like a Latin verb to me. Eru. I don't know. It sounds like, it doesn't sound like anything in particular. Whereas in this instance, she manages to get both the sound and this kind of feeling of oneness and reality, which fits the context perfectly.
Definitely. These are such good examples, and I can't help but think of Tolkien in On Fairy Stories, where he talks about how we have to clean our windows, and how actually looking at and thinking about these translations really help us to gain some fresh perspective on what is a very familiar thing. Moving on, could we talk a little bit about death and the afterlife? So I think there are so many examples that we see throughout the book, like Boromir's funeral, Gandalf's death and resurrection, and Theoden's dying words, that you do cover in the book. So how are Chinese beliefs about death and the afterlife reflected in the translation choices that are made?
Well, one thing that comes up very often is the idea that when you die, you join the ancestors. Theoden says it. A lot of them talk about sort of joining the ranks. And that narrative of what happens to you after death seems to coexist with this entirely different narrative about going to the halls of Mandos, etc. So when that is translated, it's seamless. It makes perfect sense in a Chinese context. Whether you personally believe it or not, the idea of joining your ancestors, of when you die, you join this kind of assembled rank of ancestors, is very easily comprehensible. So there's an example where it's not really adding anything to, it's not really adding a Chinese understanding to the text, but simply a kind of cultural confluence where it makes sense in Chinese. There are places where I think this is one of those places where I would say in some ways a bad translation is more interesting than a good translation. So for example, there are a few places in one of the translations, the Elim translations, where the original just says somebody perished, Thror perished, or somebody died, or, fairly straightforward language. And that translation renders that as returning to the Western heaven, Gui Xi Tian, which, idiomatically, that means somebody died, in the same way that if you say, somebody kicked the bucket, okay, well, we understand what that means. We're not taking the metaphor literally. But nonetheless, it does evoke Buddhist Pure Land ideas that in Pure Land Buddhism, you pray Amitabha, you pray to the Buddha, Amida, so that when you die, you're reborn in his presence. And he is in the West. So the setting sun is often the symbol of, the end of life and of rebirth in Amida's Pure Land. So to suggest somehow that Thror is going to be reborn in the Pure Land, that does feel like a bit of interference, a bit of a kind of, that's a place where, you'd have to say, well, perhaps it's best that the other translators, Zhu Shiheng and Deng Jiawan, didn't do that. And I think it was a bit of a mistake, where a specifically Chinese concept intrudes too much into the translation. It's complicated, of course, because, as we all know, at least the elves are going to return to the Western heaven, but in a completely different way. So,
yeah, and it's interesting as well. Like you use that example specifically about Thror, and I'm sure someone will pick me up on this in the chat if I do slightly get this wrong. Please do give me a verbal reminder. But the whole point about the dwarves is that they return to the earth. They don't have that kind of spiritual transcendence that the elves and the humans do. So yeah, I completely see where you're getting at. But again, this kind of really interesting idea of how culture can influence how you read text, whether that's in the original language or a translation. And this idea of, kind of meandering between the East and the West kind of sets us up for the next question. And this is something that you spoke about with the Tolkien and Diversity seminar, but cover more in the book. And we're wondering, could you maybe talk a little bit talk a bit about how Chinese translators approach problematic negative coding of the East as it appears in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, in the translations themselves, they pretty much just say what the original says. There's no attempt to kind of obscure it or tone it down one way or the other. For that chapter, I did look a little bit at the Tolkien fan site on the Baidu Tieba, which is like a forum, a big public forum. And I did searches on terms related to that. And I found that for the most part, there was a recognition that Tolkien does have this moral geography, that north and west are good and south and east not so good. So there was people perceived that, but I didn't find any of the fans on that site anyway actually taking offense at this. They all just shrugged their shoulders and said, well, whatever. I don't think that it was a point of contention. I think there are some problematic racial issues in Tolkien. And I wrote about those in the book, but for the most part, you don't really, none of this appears in any way in the translations. The translations just pretty much just say what the original says. And what fans make of it, it belongs to outside of the text itself. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I can't believe how fast our time is going. So we've got, I think, 2 more questions for you, Eric, to sort of round off this discussion, and then we'll give our audience a chance to ask some questions. So how has the process of studying these Chinese translations and writing this really fantastic book changed your reading of The Lord of the Rings?
I can point to specific things. I I now see Aragorn, Boromir, and Faramir very much through the wuxia lens, the lens of the Chinese knight-errant figure, which is a large genre of fiction in China. So I'm sort of slightly seeing Aragorn as if he was written by Jin Yong or something like that. So there are other places. There's a passage that talks about the Galadriel and Celeborn, their eyes, that is very vivid in the Chinese. I think much more vivid and suggestive than the original. So there's a sort of specific moments where I suddenly will hear or see a Chinese image when I'm reading or rereading the original. But in broader terms, it's I feel like I wish I could come up with some kind of big thing that sounded profound. The best I can say is that basically when I visualize Middle Earth, if I'm not being too careful, there'll be a Chinese pagoda in the background, or Gandalf will be wearing sort of Chinese robes or something. The visualization of Middle Earth has affected studying the translations has affected my visualization of the originals, in the same way that when you see the films and there's Viggo Mortensen as Aragorn, and then you read the book and Aragorn says something, you really can't help but hear Viggo Mortensen, his voice. At least we often tend to. So in the same way, there's a kind of just a general Chineseness about my reading of the book now. Yeah, I can't be more specific than that.
I suppose it's very natural as well for your reading and imagining of the world to start transforming due to your extensive reading as well. So it's interesting hearing about how your vision of Middle Earth is changing, and if you don't if you relax the imagination, then it kind of blurs the two together. That's quite an exciting idea. Thank you. And last but not least, our final question before we move over to the Q&A from our audience. So if you're in the audience, you haven't asked your question yet, then please do use the Q&A function rather than the chat. But Eric, I'm really curious. Have you got anything else going on? Any new projects?
Yes, funny you should ask that. Well, there are some additional pieces of this project which didn't make their way into a book, which I'll be looking for publishing. There's a more, that whole Ainu Lindale thing that's a big piece that I want to publish at some point. And there's a couple of other pieces that are going to continue with this project. I'm interested in doing doing a piece on the translations, multiple translations of Bilbo and Gollum's riddles. I think that would be really interesting, the riddles in multiple translations. So there's a few additional pieces that I want to, there wasn't room for them in the book. But the next project that I've just started is the same concept, except it's going to be reading Dracula in Chinese. And I think there are many, I'm not even sure how many translations there are. I'm guessing maybe 10 translations. And So I'm just at the beginning stages of that, but that promises to be quite interesting as well. An entirely different set of emotions and issues involved, much more about horror itself and fear and weird sexuality and so on that's in that book. So, look for that in probably around 6 years, because I'm not in any hurry.
Well, that's fascinating that you're going to focus on Dracula as well. A book that I'm sure Tolkien was aware of it. I mentioned it in the introduction to Tolkien and the Gothic. It's kind of like it was part of the 1890s when he was growing up and got all the other Gothic novels going on at the time. But like Dracula it's never been out of print if I remember correctly. Like it's one of those key books of the British literary tradition that's just always been there. So it'll be really interesting to find out just how many. You never know, you might come across another 20 during the next 6 years. But we wish you the absolute best of luck with your new projects. Can't wait. Um, Okay, so we're going to move on to the questions from our audience. So we have our first question from Olivia asking, the idea of translation is present throughout The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien playfully claims to have translated the text into English from some form of Andernaic, including the place names of the Shire, where he has maintained their etymologies to produce these cozy, familiar English words. Also, there is the Rohirric language, where he uses Old English to stand in for the more archaic form of Andernaic and derives proper nouns accordingly. Is there any attempt to represent these linguistic layers and complexities in the Chinese translations?
Mm. When there is when a character in the story speaks a line of Elvish or something like that, or when Gimli says some word in the Dwarvish language, it tends to be just represented as is. Either they retain it in the English, in the Roman letters, or they just transliterate it. But I would say that tends to be I don't think there was any significant attempt to try to find some sort of analogy to the different languages. And in that sense, the translations do kind of flatten the linguistic tone of the book. I brought this up with one of the translators, Deng Jiawan, and she sort of said, "Well, we want to make the book comprehensible to its readers, and there are just some things that you can't really represent very well." There's a good bit of this, actually. So, for example, when Isildur, in his letter, in the note he writes, he uses verb tenses like seemeth and fadeth and so on. And the translations, that they just use seem, fade. I mean, there isn't any of that. So that is a case where I would say, yes, the Chinese translations can't really communicate that very effectively.
Brilliant, thank you. Our next question in the Q&A, do you find, it's from Kaylee, sorry, do you find that the Chinese translations generally align with the guidelines Tolkien suggested for translators regarding what to translate and what to leave as is?
Some do and some don't. the current, I mean, I mentioned the translator Deng Jiawan, Joy Deng. She's a Taiwan-based translator, and she is the foremost translator of everything Tolkien into Chinese. She's soon to have a Chinese translation of On Fairy Stories is going to be published this year. She's done tons of stuff, and she takes it very seriously. She's very faithful to Professor Tolkien, I would say. And so her work, you know, the issue of whether you translate or transliterate, I think she's attentive to that. It's just that in some cases it's not, it might be ambiguous, but she's attentive to that, I think. But there's an earlier translation that might play a little fast and loose with what Tolkien wanted.
I'm still muted. That does not. Okay, so we do have a question about the Silmarillion. So the conflict between the elves, the Valar, and Morgoth. Like, how was it conceptualized to be presented in the Chinese text? How was it presented conceptualized?
Wuxia and Xianxia elements. I would have to think about that or spend more time with those passages. When I was looking at Silmarillion, I was mostly looking at those early cosmological passages. So where you see the wuxia, xianxia elements tends to be, you know, in those places where there's a battle campaign or where people are rousing the troops, you know, Theoden and the muster, you know, there you get a real wuxia vibe. But I'm not sure about the particular example.
Brilliant, thank you. Our next one is from Simon Petit, who has asked, I'm wondering, what is your take on translator notes? Is this something you like to see?
I love to see translators' notes. I mean, for me, they're among the most interesting things. And in some cases, the translator's notes just helps the native reader to kind of tune into what the story's about. And that can be very helpful. It adds another frame. So we have this translator's note frame and sometimes translator's postface. But then you have the Tolkien's prefaces and so on, and then you have, so it adds another frame, but I always find them very interesting. And I think people understand them as a frame. It's not not the real part of the story. So I don't think it's causing any problems.
Yeah, and we're always fascinated by notes. We went to the was it the British Library Fantasy Exhibition last year, and they had some of the notes from different texts, and it's just such an exciting opportunity to have that chance to look at the drafts, the process, the scribbles in many places as well. And you know, like if anyone has read like the first draft of Lord of the Rings, like Tolkien like edited himself straight away, I think, and like crossed out the first word or so. So yeah. Okay, so we've got a question as well here. So asking kind of about curiosity, how long have you been learning Chinese, and like how well do you read Chinese, and kind of from this onwards, there's this anticipation that there's going to be like an explosion of new Chinese versions of Lord of the Rings. Like are you thinking about keeping track with them in a chance to kind of like expand your discussions in this book, or maybe do a sequel book?
Sequel. I'm so in terms of my own Chinese, much of my academic work has been on translating texts. So it's a lot easier to translate a text than to carry on a conversation, because you can take your time. So I was reading medieval Buddhist texts for a long time. Lived in China for a while, lived in Taiwan for a while. But obviously I'm not a native speaker, and so I'm very aware that I'm sure this book is, there are lots of missed opportunities. So if there is anyone who would like to take the torch and keep track of these new versions, I'm happy to see that happen. I mean, the thing with translations is that there are always going to be another translation. Even if it's a really good translation, give it another 10 years, there'll be another one. So it is an ongoing process. And at a certain point, I had to just stop. It's unfortunate that since I finished the book, Dung has published her translation of The Hobbit, which I would have liked to have included, but at some point you have to stop. So I'll probably continue to collect future translations, but I don't know if I'm going to write a sequel.
Brilliant. We have a question now about poetry. Could you talk a bit about the approach of the Chinese translators with regard to the poems in The Lord of the Rings?
Yeah, I was quite interested in poetic forms comparatively, Chinese and pre-modern English poetic forms. And there are, I wondered perhaps if a translator might try to use one of the traditional Chinese poetic forms to represent the verses. But for the most part, they went with meaning rather than form. In other words, for example, traditional Chinese poetry has the same number of characters per line. It might be 4 lines or 8 lines, but it'll have 7 characters, say, or 5 characters, kind of every single line the same length, usually, for the most part. But the translations of the poetry didn't attempt to do this, which is probably for the best. Probably better to go for a reasonably accurate representation of the meaning. Yeah, that's an interesting question. One other thing about the poetry is that some people have said this, that the thing that they don't like about Lord of the Rings is all this poetry, right? I'm sure you don't agree, but you've perhaps heard it, that they're just going along and all of a sudden somebody breaks into verse for no reason, like after Boromir's death. They should be running after those kidnapped hobbits, but instead they're sitting there composing these funeral verses, and yet that in pre-modern Chinese literature is totally normal. It happens all the time when you read the older literature. So if it's a bit jarring to a modern English reader, it wouldn't be so jarring to a Chinese reader, I would say. I wish we could just spontaneously speak in sonnets. Wouldn't that be great?
It would be really fun. And I think there's probably a huge number of people who are really anticipating the collected poetry of J.R.R. Tolkien that's coming out later this year. So I think there's probably a lot of poetry fans in our audience tonight.
Hmm.
Yeah, certainly. I need it for my PhD, so it'll be really interesting to see what new poems, especially I think like some of the early poems are going to be published. So yeah, it'll be fascinating. I think a couple of people have just pointed out that they're already on pre-order. Uh,
Mm.
so there we go. Well, I am really sad to report that we unfortunately have come to the end of this interview. And I've absolutely loved it. I've learned so much. So Eric, just a personal point from me. Thank you so much for coming and talking about your book as well. And I'm sure many people have learned new insights into it. And so I think at the moment, is it just in hardback or is it also has the paperback come out?
It's in hardback at the moment, but there will be a paperback relatively soon.
Yeah. So just a reminder to everyone, if you are interested, the Perspectives in Fantasy series by Bloomsbury. So they normally have this black cover. So please do check them out. The paperbacks, I think from recollection, I think you're looking about 25 pounds. So it's headed up by Brian Attenbury, Dimitra Feeney, and Matthew Sangster. And if you look in the contents page, there are a few more books on the way from that series. So please do go and check them out. We've really enjoyed having this opportunity to host Eric, and this isn't the first time. We also hosted Nick Groom. Was it last year, Hannah, when you interviewed him?
Yeah, it was last year. It was just after Oxenmoot, so September last year.
Yeah. So we are hoping that actually we're going to have more of these opportunities to talk to authors and for you to have an opportunity to hear their insights and a couple of behind the scenes moments, such as what Eric shared with us today. So yes, please do keep your eye on the Tolkien Society for new events. And I'm going to stop talking and just hand over to Hannah.
Yeah, I just want to echo Will and say thank you so much for your time, Eric. It has been so fascinating. I think
Thank
we've
you.
all learned a lot, and honestly, I loved your book. And as someone who knows nothing about Chinese or translations, I found it so interesting. So thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who could join us today. It's been really, really wonderful. Thank you for all your great questions. And yes, we will say goodbye now.